Hi, I'm honored today to have with us the brilliant, erudite, forthright, and easy to pronounce Daniel Jupp. He has spared us many syllables. I'm in the monosyllabic last name club as well. So the two of us should not really dally on any mispronunciations of names. Daniel is a good friend of mine, and he is, I guess what, an enemy of the state these days? I don't know.
Well, it's funny you should say that because technically I am. I just found out today that the publication that publishes most of my material now, an online magazine called The Conservative Woman, which is a fairly, moderate, mainstream-ish publication. Nobody there has ever been involved in violence or anything bad. And it was mentioned on a prevent strategy document as a far-right influencer group. So I don't know if your viewers are aware, but Prevent is the UK anti-terror strategy. So it was created in the wake of Islamic bombings and terrorist attacks. And it's supposed to do two things at once. It's supposed to explain to police forces and intelligence agencies who is a threat, and it's supposed to de-radicalize people who are threats. So that's what the prevent strategy is. And it's been involved in ludicrous things before, where, in the past they said that one of the ways you could spot people being drawn into far-right terrorism or far-right extremism was if they watched Great Railway Journeys with Michael Portillo. And that was seriously in one of their
I saw that in your article today, and I just thought that was tongue-in-cheek. I thought you were just going for effect,
No, it's actually true that they had in an earlier document, they'd listed as one of the things that might show someone's being drawn into far-right extremism, that they watched Great Railway Journeys with former Conservative Minister Michael Portillo, which is a show about liking steam trains, essentially. So apparently,
first it's liking steam trains, then it's liking bicycles. Then God knows where it might lead to.
Yeah, I know. I mean, all sorts of things could happen. You could be, noting down serial numbers of trains or doing other dangerous things like that, which is, utterly absurd. But that's the scenario we're in, where the people in charge of deciding whether something is a terrorist threat are really insane enough to think that watching Great Railway Journeys might get you there. And it's all part of this kind of deflection whereby, our intelligence services, our police are trying to pretend that there's as big a threat from, white middle-class people or white working-class people in particular, as there is from Islamic extremism. They want to try and balance the two things. And the unfortunate reality for them is that there's a lot of Islamic actual terrorism, and there isn't any far-right terrorism. So they get to the point of, labeling things more and more ridiculously as far-right. And I was wandering around completely unaware that I was included in this. I knew that my views were not the kind of views that the government would like. But apparently back in June, in my county, in Essex, where I live, local government, Essex County Council members or staff were given a presentation saying that, these are far-right groups that you have to worry about. And one of them was the publication that I write for, which is really, really extraordinary because, as I say, as far as I'm aware, nobody who writes for it has a criminal record. Nobody who runs it does. And none of us have advocated violence at any stage. but we've been listed in this material that's supposed to prevent terrorism.
Well, it's always begging the question. I mean, when you put facts and evidence that are not there, so their original premise is wrong. They're not looking for terrorism at all. They're looking to stamp out political opposition.
Yeah, and that's essentially what it's for. And it's kind of related in a way to what's happening in the US and what's been happening in the US, because the essential problem is that we've got, which we've probably discussed before in one of our other chats, but the essential problem is that the people defining what is extreme are themselves extremists. And so they're defining normal things as extreme, whilst not doing the same with genuinely dangerous attitudes. So, for example, in the UK, we had, when we had the Southport riots, we had a Labour councillor at the time, a guy called Ricky Jones, who was filmed telling people to go out and slit people's throats. He said they need their throats slit. And he said this publicly. It was filmed. All the evidence was there that this was encouragement of violence and incitement of violence. And he was found not guilty. It went to court. He was arrested. It went to court, but he was found not guilty. Whereas, we at the same time in the UK, we had Lucy Connolly, who made a rhetorical statement that was clearly non-literal, and she was put in prison for 31 months. She was the wife of a Conservative councillor. So there's a clear kind of two-tier policing going on in the UK now, where someone can say something that's literally violent and an encouragement of violence if they're on the left, and it's legal and allowed and goes ahead with no repercussions, or they can say something that's rhetorical and an expression of frustration on the right, and they get put in prison. So it's a pretty bad situation to be in.
Yeah, I was just watching a post on X of a British guy, and I think he's reformed, and he had one of those kind of Stephen Crowder, Charlie Kirk-ian signs, like "Prove me wrong" on something, and it's like mass immigration is good for the UK, and so he was taking the contrary position.
Yeah.
And he had, the kind of standard Stephen Crowder, Charlie Kirk formulation of sitting in the public square, a couple of cameras around, and willing to take anybody as questioners. And that's what he was doing. And we have this image of the UK as like little Cotswold, white and timber, whatever that's called, village, but it's probably the actual UK. It's a big, ugly, brutalist square of buildings pastiched together, mismatched or whatever. So it didn't look like quaint UK, but it's a big open square, and somebody has a hood naturally. I think one of the real downsides of COVID is that all this kind of cloaking became normalized, but kind of face obscured with the hood over, and on camera attacks them, like overturns the table, whatever. And one of the people associated with the Charlie Kirk-like figure, I don't remember his name, he, his bodyguard or whatever, tackles the guy and is making a citizen's arrest, holding. But there are a bunch of other lefty types, not their handedness, but their mental state. And then they pour something on this guy. I don't know what it was. It was red. It may be ketchup, or I have no idea. Or maybe you don't have ketchup there, but whatever it was. So they're trying to stop this. They're trying to get him away from their compatriot, their comrade in arms. And eventually the police show up, and mind you, they're just a bunch. Oh my God. It's like, I get it. Back in the day, it was kind of quaint and cute. They, the bobbies and whatnot, they didn't have, weren't armed and whatnot, but the police show up, and one is like I don't know if you still use feet and inches, but she's like 5'1", petite, and another guy, a guy there, and he's makes up for his adequacy in height with his inadequacy in theory, because he says, "Oh, well, you're provoking them. You're provoking them." Anyway, I think the perpetrator gets off scot-free. And whom do they arrest? They arrest the bodyguard and the Stephen Crowder, Charlie Kirk, Nigel Farage, promoting kind of guy. It was just the most blatant. The whole thing's on tape, or whatever we call pixels these days.
Yeah, well, that's fairly typical. It's that, they're policing offence, and they're policing offence towards certain groups. They're not policing assault. That gets policed a lot less. And really, what happens in those circumstances is that the people in charge of the police are ideologically aligned with leftist protesters and leftist attitudes and globalist ones as well. So that you get unjust treatment and you get unjust law, because they are very much on a side, which is the opposite of what the police should be, and it's partly driven as well, I think, by fear, because it is simply easier to arrest the average right-wing protester or right-wing person than it is to arrest these left-wing people or, for example, very radicalized Muslims. They know which group will fight back the most, and they know which group will obey the law. So, but there are very, very much fewer people on the right who are prepared to use violence for political ends. And, the police know this. The police know. I mean, we had the case with, say, for example, we had a football match that was banned. And the reason it was banned, we're told, is because that Jewish football fans would pose a threat to people. And that's what the police declared, that they had intelligence that the Jewish football fans coming in from Israel would cause a threat to people, and that they'd been linked to football hooliganism. It turns out that this was a complete lie. People like me knew it was a lie instantly, but it was a complete lie because they claimed that they had Dutch intelligence on this. And then the Dutch authorities said, no, you don't. It was all a fiction. The police chief involved has had to resign early, but he's not lost his pension because he outright lied about why the fans of this club were banned from attending a match that Aston Villa were playing in Birmingham. Now, Birmingham has a very high Muslim population, and the area that the football ground is situated was 70% Muslim in that area, and Muslims had threatened to. It was at the height of the whole Hamas-Israel conflict recently, and Muslims in that area were threatening to riot or to be violent, but they don't want to declare that it was Muslims who were making that threat. So they made up this story about the fans of the Israeli team being a threat. And that's what they do. They simply transfer guilt from the guilty to the innocent because that's easier to police.
No, you see how easy it is to knock over the tower, the Jenga tower. You see something like the edifice of civil law and civilization is built based on civility and civics and all that kind of stuff. And you have the police, and they are supposed to be the arbiters of right and wrong and get people separated and whatnot. But when the system, it's apparently not that hard to corrupt the system. Muslims still are a distinct minority in the UK. That is changing rapidly, but still they are. And it's there are other groups that might outnumber them. Say non-Muslim subcontinent Indians, Hindus, and whatnot. But if you agitate and then you organize, you can kind of subvert the whole system. You get a few people who are just timid and they fear for themselves, maybe validly. They fear for their lives, and you are, doxing people. And if you use that same phrase, you expose them, where they go to school, where the kids go to school, where they live, and all that kind of stuff. And then they are under constant threat. Nobody wants to do that. I mean, they've turned everybody into a Salman Rushdie. And Salman Rushdie had a good run there, but he eventually got attacked again. Even in hiding, whatever. And so, it's kind of like terrorism works. It's been a very lucrative industry. Nasser Arafat.
Absolutely, and it works particularly on those who are ideologically aligned with it anyway, or on those who are incredibly weak. And Western governments have been both. They've been ideologically aligned with mass immigration, and ideologically aligned with immigrant groups that are behaving in antisocial manners, because they've all gone through university where they've been told the university recruitment in the police was a real problem, because they got rid of old traditional coppers who rose through the ranks, and they replaced them with people who'd been on university courses telling them that Muslims are inherently an oppressed group. And then they act in accordance with that. They've been indoctrinated to side with that group, because that's a designated victim group. And these categories that are defined by leftist ideologists at university are fixed. You don't get out of them based on behaviour. So, the white working class are all considered oppressors and privileged, even though they have very little. And the any immigrant community that behaves in an antisocial manner, that must be the fault of society, or that must be the fault of racism, or that must be that they've been offended, and those who offended them are in the wrong. Sadly, when you've got that ideological input, this is how the law functions.
Yeah, there's also people unwilling to kind of apply the opposite pressure, and it would be not through violence but through politics. And the bulwark, kind of the well-meaning, quote unquote, right in either sense of the word, thinking populace, is somewhat diluted by this sensibility of kind of feminization of society. And obviously women are feminized, but what God sad calls suicidal empathy, or is that what he said? And it's kind of like a weird death wish by proxy. I don't know if they even see it as that.
I did a piece on this recently, which I called Lord Longford's Ghost Smiling, because many years ago there was a guy who'd been born in the sort of middle aristocracy in the UK, and he became a socialist Labour politician, and he was sort of quite a famous figure for many years, and was politically active right up to his death at the age of 95. But he became most famous for supporting the Moors murderers. And the Moors murderers were a sadistic pair of child sex killers. So they abducted 5 people between the ages of 10 and 17, and they murdered each of them. And they, in one instance with the youngest victim, they recorded themselves torturing this 10-year-old girl. And the recording is horrific. You can even people have been psychologically affected even by reading the transcripts of what's on that recording. And the jurors at the time, this was in the 1960s, the jurors at the time were warned that this would haunt them for the rest of their lives. So, these were really, really despicable crimes, sexually motivated, where they raped and tortured children and teenagers. Lord Longford had been a prison reformer and a campaigner for prison reform and, you know, fair treatment of prisoners. He took up the case of arguing that Myra Hindley, the female part of the duo, should be released, and he campaigned for her release for decades. He maintained that she was a sort of a woman who'd been led astray by Ian Brady, the male of the two. Even though the evidence is clear on that tape of one of the killings, and from Brady himself and from others, that she was a fairly active participant, you know, and that she engaged in sexual torture of the victims as well. So Longford campaigned for her again and again and again, year after year, trying to get her parole. And I said in my piece that, in a way, he is reflective of where Western society is as a whole now. You know, back in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, when he was campaigning for Myra Hindley's release, he was an outlier that most people regarded as a lunatic. You know, he had this moral inversion where he spent far more time worrying about the perpetrators of a grotesque crime than the victims of that grotesque crime. But I'd say that his attitude is possibly one of the most powerful political ideas in the Western world today. And it's dominant amongst most of those people who call themselves left-wing, you know, and it's what we see when they are, for example, on the side of Hamas instead of on the side of Israel, or when they are, you know, outraged that ICE are trying to arrest foreign-born criminals who are, in many cases, violent and dangerous. It's this sympathy for the devil. It's this moral inversion whereby we're told that policing people who are violent or dangerous is fascism, and supporting people who are violent and dangerous is enlightened compassion. And it's, you know, Lord Longford was the outlier of that. His attitudes are the attitudes that are very, very prevalent on the left everywhere in the Western world today.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing. I don't really have anything to add to that, except we see similarities, as you mentioned. You know, there's a meme that's been in the U.S. for a long time called Florida Man, and I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but it's always somebody doing something, because, you know, Florida's a big mix. There's like, yeah, you know, the urban exodus from the Northeast and whatnot, and there's oldsters, there are natives, there's kind of the Alabama belt, rednecks, whatever, you know, the panhandle. So it's a big mix. It's warm weather all the time. People not wearing much clothes. There's a lot of, you know, shenanigans and whatnot. So the meme has always been Florida Man, and something crazy, you know, wrestling an alligator, I don't know, making a kite out of underwear and trying to fly it, you know, yeah. Or you know, try to put yourself to, you know, all kinds of crazy things. And it's always Florida Man. So that's become the thing. Whenever they find somebody doing something really weird, it's like Florida Man, I don't know,
yeah,
does this. But I saw a piece today. Somebody tried to release Luigi Mangione, and this is not one of the Mario brothers. It's the guy who shot. Yeah. I can't remember his name, unfortunately. The healthcare executive in cold blood. I think his name was Hutchinson or something. I don't remember, but you know, and somehow Luigi's the hero. This is again an inversion, whatever. He just, you know, picked him out somewhat randomly, and the guy was just done. And because Luigi, I guess, you know, is wealthy, works out, and he's young and still, you know, cute for whatever. He became kind of a cult hero, like, you know.
Yeah,
it's not the same as Che Guevara. We know that, you know, Che Guevara was probably, you know, bigger murderer and had the good-looking face and whatnot, but it has that kind of redolence. So Luigi, you know, so somebody tried to free him by going to New York City and posing as an FBI, and he had some documents, and try to get Luigi out, and he's supposed to be somewhere else. Here's my and so that anyway. So the articles, New York, Minnesota man shows
It's an
up.
incredibly dumb plan, isn't it?
Yeah, so I just think that Florida man seems to be taken over by Minnesota man. Alex
Yeah.
Preddy was actually from Wisconsin, but he's in Minnesota. George Floyd, Minnesota man, who everybody rioting, and all this stuff. Everyone seems to be flocking to Minnesota. I was in Minnesota 1,000 years ago. Maybe 40 something years ago, and hugely pleasant place. And historically, I went to medical school in Rochester, New York, which is like the snowiest, rainiest, cloudiest place in the country, except for parts of Minnesota, maybe. But it's in the snow belt. And when I got to medical school there, I was like, oh my God, it's going to be so dismal because it's snowing and cold. You never see the sun. And frankly, so whatever studies they did back in the day, Rochester was like New York was like the happiest place in the country. And it was always second to like Minneapolis, St. Paul. This was the best functioning, happiest, lowest crime place in the country was Minneapolis. But it had kind of like Nordic Viking stock, and a bunch of Lutherans, and the whole joke of Lake Wobegon was Minnesota, that things were so happy there that Garrison Keillor would he basically ate and dined on NPR, no less, public radio and TV, PBS, on this kind of concept that the thing was so mild and bland in Minneapolis, Minnesota, whatever the whole region, that the little tiniest little quirk would be hilarious. Where all the kids are above average. But you could argue on an IQ basis that is exactly inverted currently. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, what happened is Minnesota became a major refugee center for the US.
It's only still this small, relatively small fraction. I mean, they say 100,000 or whatever. It's probably more than that. But still, Minnesota is not huge, and Minneapolis, St. Paul is not a huge city, but it's probably 5, 6, 7 times as big as that. And Minnesota is a state, probably, I don't know, I'm just guessing, maybe 7, 8, 10, 4, 13, I don't know, whatever, maybe 8, 10 million people. I'm not sure the number. But it should be enough to have reasonable ballast against that. But again, I think it's this tipping point thing.
I think that the problem there is leftists always struggle with the idea of per capita. They don't understand what it is, or they pretend not to, because I've seen people saying there's only this many immigrants in Minnesota, so why is it an issue? Well, Minnesota as a whole, as 2% of the US population and 13% of the US population of immigrants. So it was used as a place to dump these people. That's what per capita would tell you, that this is not a good idea. But per capita is something that leftists always choose to ignore. For example, they choose to ignore it in the UK when they tell us, they'll say, well, actually, there are more white child abusers than there are Muslim, Pakistani descended child abusers. Yes, because there's a lot more white people in the UK than there is Pakistani descended Muslims, but per capita, by their numbers, by how many of them there are within the population as a whole, it's very disproportionate in the non-leftist direction, in the way that they don't want to talk about. So that's what they're doing when they talk about, oh, there's only this many immigrants in Minnesota. They're a big chunk of the population, a big chunk of the US total of people who've been let in as immigrants. But the crime at the moment isn't obviously coming purely from Somalian fraudsters in Minnesota, though a lot of it is. It's white middle class people generally, classically people who work in care industries, like what was his name?
Alex Pretty.
Yes. The thing with Alex Pretty is he worked in the care industry. The care industry is massively left wing. One of the two largest employers in Minnesota is a care organisation. And the reason that the care is massively left wing, and people involved in care and medicine are predisposed to be left wing, it's not because they're more compassionate than other people. It's because or more empathetic than other people, and left-wing politics is empathetic and kind. It's because they get paid by the state generally, especially in the UK with the NHS, but that they're massively predisposed to vote for the people who pay them. And then they adopt the attitude to the people who pay them. It works the same way in education with why are so many academics left wing. Well, for a start, there's confirmation bias and a kind of crowd impact once they reach a certain level of dominance. But fundamentally, when you drill down, these are people who are paid by a big state and big state politics, which is the left. So underneath all the talk of empathy, it's self-interest. Ultimately, they get paid by this system, and therefore they like this system, even when this system is going wrong.
Yeah, no, I agree. So, here we are presented, on this side, the MD who's not a leftist and the academic PhD who's not a leftist. So, I don't know.
We are brave exceptions to the rule, Randy. We are the people who had the mental fortitude to resist the instruction.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm difficult to program. My wife has struggled with this.
Mine has too, with me, that is, not with you.
Yeah. It's like Groucho Marx said, I would never join any group that would take the likes of me as a member.
Yeah.
So my dad had an independent streak. He was an attorney, and we lived in New York City, and New York City at that time had moderate Democrats, left of Democrats, socialists, left of socialists, anarchists, whatever. There was not really much of a conservative presence. So I only knew Democrats when I grew up, and I was a Democrat. My dad was probably a Democrat, but I did hear from him, not that Democrat, not the leftist, not the communist, and he had some sensibility about it. But he was a solo guy also, and I'm, we're not our parents per se, and my kids are not me, but there's some themes of kind of like, bristly independent, and he wound up, working for himself. He was a solo attorney. I wound up being a solo physician. There's certain, types of things that rankle, and whether you're going to pursue the independence. And along that way, when you do that, you have to meet payroll. You have to pay your own bills. I ran a campaign for a candidate for mayor of our local leafy suburb, Newton, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, probably like 11 years ago or so, and maybe a little longer. For me, whatever the number is. I put a little, I made up a kind of a piece, got in the local newspaper about how the city budgets things. And they have unions. They don't really negotiate. They can't hire teachers individually. They can't, farm their employees. Everything's kind of done this big blob, like an amoeba, or maybe a little more like a cruise ship, kind of just moving along. You can't change any course. Everything's kind of predestined. It's too big. And, but when you're doing something for your house, so when they were like trying to build a new school at the time, and the amount of money they spent was probably 4 times what it would have been spent if, say Donald Trump or any other reasonable self-interested developer had wanted to do it, with a bottom line. And we were having some renovations of the house at the time, and I got, for anything we did, plumbing, this and that, I got 3 or 4 contractors. I compared the values, all this kind of stuff. The city never does that. It's all just kind of a thing. It's not your money. It's OPM, other people's money. And, the city here votes very left because along the same lines, what you're saying, my suburb's close enough to Boston. A lot of people are working in government. They're working at Harvard or the other university. Well, it's like a, quote unquote Mecca for universities. Although, oddly enough, Mecca, I don't think has any liberal arts university. Total side note.
Yeah.
Like they always call this the Mecca for healthcare and the Mecca for universities, as if that's the thing. But just a total side note, but I was looking up, it just puzzled me. Like Saudi, I think, has 0 rivers and 0 lakes. There's like no lakes in Saudi Arabia. There's probably no trees in Iceland. And this concept of liberal arts university, this kind of dialectic, this thought of debating stuff, does that actually go on in the Islamic Republic of fill in the blank? And they have technical schools, and they kind of import some universities here and there, people to lecture to the elites and whatnot. But anyway, so that's a side.
I think Islam has a strong history of debate. Unfortunately, it's primarily debate about how you treat your sex slaves, or which groups you're allowed to slaughter and which ones you aren't, and that kind of thing, or maybe whether Muhammad rode to the moon on the back of a horse, and that sort of thing. Yeah. I mean, people will say that this is Islamophobic, but I've actually seen footage again and again of very serious Islamic scholars, discussing things that are utterly absurd with a real intensity and interest. If anything you want to say that's disparaging will be real, from what I've seen of those kind of videos. But obviously that's one of the kind of things that makes me a far right extremist, that I'm aware of that.
Yeah, no, it's a funny thing. I just want to finish my point about that election campaign, was that the city never does that kind of budgeting. They don't do any budgeting. When you have to do a budget, that almost ipso facto turns you more to the right. When you have to make your own bills and you have to come up against having to make choices, you appreciate the free market rather than coercion. If you're big enough, you don't care. And if you're on, so this is again, a slight diversion, but I think it speaks to kind of the political dialectic. I don't know where I saw it. It's not original to me, but I saw the hamburger theory of politics. And so a hamburger, it's got 2 soft, fluffy buns, and the meat is in the middle. And so this guy had the hamburger theory of politics, where the meat are the conservatives these days. This is like 20-something years ago.
Yeah.
I think this is the Trumpian phenomenon, that he's going for the hamburger. Not only does he like hamburgers, and apparently he was a McDonald's salesman before he became president.
Yeah.
I don't know if he did the fry later or the booth, but anyway, but both buns, the upper class and the lower class, are the left. This is an unusual phenomenon that doesn't, not historically in the peerage or whatever, if you go back in the UK or the country club Republicans, that kind of stuff, where the top bunch was the ones who want to conserve society, because, that keeps the wealth and whatnot. But now there's kind of the suicidal empathy at the top bun. They worry that the bottom bun, will aggregate and foment violence against them. So they want to ally themselves with the bottom bun. So the bottom and the top bun are not the meat. They're not the functioning part of society that has all the nutrients and whatnot, the kind of rock solid, calorie dense part. They're the fluffier parts that are, can more susceptible to getting overloaded by too much ketchup or vinegar, or whatever. And the lower one is dependent on the juice seeping from the meat in the middle. So that's where most of your energy is getting generated, and it seeps down to the bottom. So the money, the transfer payments come from the meat, the working class, and probably a little bit from the bun, whatever. So I don't want to do this too much, but it's kind of like the inimical part where the 2 buns, in a sense, are attacking the meat. In this case, when you have something like Minnesota, where there's this kind of suicidal empathy of the upper class, of the middle, whatever we call middle, whatever, people are not in the stream of having to make their own money, and they're part of the academic bubble, or they're part of the government bubble that keeps them secure. And how does it keep them secure? By having this kind of edifice of absorbing taxpayer money, absorbing money from the meat. You're getting the juices from the meat part, from the top and the bottom, and the top gets it through the universities, and the fact that most of the universities are government owned and government sponsored, and there's union and whatnot. And the professors have sinecures, they have tenure and whatnot. And so they're getting it from the meat, and the bottom part's getting it from the meat from transfer payments. And so then they get the free tuition to go to the colleges that keep the colleges going, that keep the elites happy. So it's a kind of a weird system. And once you see it,
I think the worst thing that happened to the Western world was the point at which the left, the radical left, the very extreme left, worked out that they needed money on their side and set about getting that. And the first people to do that really were Weather Underground in the US. And, that's when you had an actual terrorist organization base themselves at a university. So this unreal environment sustained by other people's money, where you have access to impressionable and malleable young minds. That all of the features that we see today, where extremist ideas begin at universities, that they start in that period, and you see it with Weather Underground. Weather Underground represents the moment that the old order lost, just as McCarthy's disgrace in the US also represents the moment that the old order lost. And what you saw there is that Weather Underground recruited rich people as backers. And, the clever thing they did is that these far left terrorist groups started going after the children of the super rich. And that's how they got their money. And loads and loads of these very hard, violent groups from the 60s and the 70s. Black Panthers as well tried to do it, although Black Panthers were less successful, and they tried to bankroll themselves through bank robberies, which Stalin had done when he was a revolutionary. That's automatically riskier and automatically fails more often. But Weather Underground got themselves legitimized, because some of them studied the law and became very successful lawyers, never giving up their radical ideas, but becoming part of the establishment. Bill Ayers became a respected educator and an early mentor of Barack Obama. And these were terrorists. These were outright terrorists. Barack Obama in office, and Bill Clinton to a slightly lesser extent. When both of those were in office, they released people who had been 1960s terrorists, who were the few that were still in prison.
Yeah, they did the FALN, the Puerto Rican FALN Clinton released en masse. And they were the ones who had actually bombed the White House. And what we saw with that is once they aligned with the super wealthy, and the deal effectively became the super wealthy will fund radical extremism in social attitudes and policies, and those will become dominant in society. But at the same time, all of your rhetoric about wealth and the 1% and the billionaires, or millionaires, will conveniently ignore the rich people who fund you. There's no leftist that ever complains about the wealth of Alex Soros or his father. There's all this rhetoric against inheritance, against wealth creation. Well, the Democrat Party has had more family dynasties of very rich politicians than the Republican Party has. They both had a tendency to get rich quick. Like apparently Ilhan, her name, it's like almost comically, ill-begotten, Ilhan Gaines. She went from like $30,000 to $30 million. She's got a vineyard, which I think is haram, if I have the word correct. That makes no wine
as well. Isn't she
worth
worth 25 million?
somehow.
Yeah, isn't AOC worth 25 million or something like that as well? Now?
Yeah, and what have you seen this tracker that shows Nancy Pelosi's stock bets versus Warren Buffett's? I mean,
Yes.
she's like double, which turns out almost to be like an exponential aspect better at stock predicting than Warren Buffett.
Yeah.
Go figure.
Yeah. How did that happen? The people in charge of the people in charge of financial legislation that hugely affects the markets are really good at predicting the markets. What's going on there? Insider trading, obviously.
Yeah, no, I had a gentleman on my show, Professor Vasant Dar at NYU, who was on the early phases of AI, and I gather he made money for other people, I'm sure for himself as well, because he was able to do the timing of the market, this kind of day trading, but later, decades later became day trading. And he was looking on the algorithms and trying to see how trades are made and, kind of the bounce and whatever. And so he came up with a way to figure that out. This is like going back to maybe the 90s or whatever, maybe late 80s. And this was, before the computers were really in big swing and whatnot. And there were gaps to be had. But this required a lot of intelligence, a lot of work, and the forthright, biggest, best minds who spend all their time doing this. Now, Nancy Pelosi, for all her wonderful skills and talents, that's not her primary goal, and she's a unitary person. So what makes her skills so much better than all the great minds all put together, Humpty Dumpty, that she can crack this egg much better than anybody else can. And it's like, well, I don't know. So it comes down to timing the market. Now, if you have a big, lead in of weeks and months, then you can time the market, even better. And along this line, it's not quite the same thing. A friend of mine, Eric Singer, wrote a book called The Congressional Effect, probably 20 something years ago, and it was a stock type of book, how to make money in the stock. And he pointed out the congressional effect when the Congress is in recess. And so our legislature, federal, is in recess. The stock market does better. So if you just did the hokey pokey, I don't know if that's a British thing, but you put your money in, you take your money out. So if you were just do this binary thing, which doesn't matter what stocks you pick, you put your money in the market when Congress is in recess. So during the summer months and whatnot, Christmas, all this kind of stuff. And then you just take your money out and put in whatever, under your mattress. You will make money because, and so his theory was the mere fact that Congress is in session has companies jittery because all the congressman person has to do is think, furniture. I wonder what kind of stains they put on your bureau. I wonder if those stains are safe. And furniture is like something nobody thinks about. And so all the cabinet makers, they've been fine. They don't deal with government. All of a sudden, they're in the news. Like, what? What about our stains? What do we have to do? And they get on the phone to their Congress people, the lobbyists, and all of a sudden, the guy goes out to basically dines on the lobbyist money that the furniture industry cares about. All of a sudden, and you can make this up. It doesn't really matter. What about books? Where do we get all that paper? All they have to do is just like have an idea bubble, and everybody congregates to them, and they have to bicker, and they become the toll booth of whatever industry they choose to. It doesn't really matter. Your eyeglasses. They could say, wow, what do eyeglasses do for retinal vision over time? Have we ever thought about that? Like, why are people going blind? What's macular degeneration? Everyone, they're all wearing glasses. But that glasses can't be good. And all they have to do is just say that thing. And all of a sudden, they're getting paid. And it's just an incredible thing, incredible power. And so, I don't know if it's still there, the congressional effect, but when they're gone, the companies can kind of relax and do what companies do, which is make eyeglasses, make books, make cabinets, all that kind of stuff in relatively peaceful fashion. But the political aspect, the machinations, are costly, and it's not quite the terrorism of Yasser Arafat, whatnot, but it's kind of like this nonstop, drip, drip, drip torture.
And I think there's a basic kind of competence impact as well. There's that which is basically corruption. But there's competence as well because I think Thoreau was right when he said that government is best which governs least of all. Because they're not making the mistakes. and then they're not giving the opportunities for corruption. So yeah, I mean, Spain recently had a period where they were, you know, unable to form a government because they'd had various coalitions fall apart, and they had a short period where they had no government at all, and their economy improved in that period. You know, so you know, it's as Ronald Reagan used to say, you know, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. It's a terrifying thing to hear. But
Yeah.
yeah,
He also has a cycle
the
of
problem
business,
is
which
now we've moved so far beyond it being, you know, general incompetence into it being ideologically driven stuff, and into it being basically people who are kind of asset stripping a dying Western world that they have helped kill. You know, which is a grim way of putting it, but you know, the reality.
yeah, no, it's sadness. So let's get back to your UK, which unfortunately I'm going to start calling by its actual UK name, UCK. I mean, like UCK.
Yeah.
What is it? Or ICK?
What?
What
Yeah.
or UCK?
Well, I mean,
How did
another thing that we haven't mentioned, which I think links into this, the stuff we said earlier about how the people defining what's extreme are themselves extremists, right? And that's what you see in Minnesota, and you, with this ludicrous crap about the Trump government being fascist that is everywhere in Western media. You know, they present us with that and try and find a word of criticism of China in the same magazines, the same issues, you know, from the same newsreaders. You won't find it. And you know, Mark Carney goes to Canada, goes to Davos on behalf of Canada, and he gives a turgid little speech full of hypocrisies, where he uses a quote from Václav Havel, an anti-communist campaigner, to essentially support him aligning Canada with the Chinese Communist Party. And the whole Western media tell us that this was a great speech and this was a wonderful speech, and this is the mature, sensible, reasonable person offering an alternative to, you know, Donald Trump's craziness. Well, just as Donald Trump is opposing domestic terrorism in Minnesota, as he should do, and trying to get border laws and immigration laws enforced as is his moral duty as president, and then being hit with all this stuff claiming that these sensible measures are fascism. You know, the things that Trump has advocated abroad, like the disagreement about Greenland or like the action in Venezuela, are part of a geopolitical strategy that is aware of the threat of China, where the UK government and the Canadian government are aligning with China, but they consider themselves the moderates. Well, China has concentration camps. China has zero freedom. China has activities like the harvesting of organs from living prisoners, you know, and there's no criticism of aligning with China, but there is criticism of aligning with Donald Trump. And this is how insane things have become, because the people who are the mainstream are the extremists. And that happened first when Weather Underground and groups like that became respectable, and when kids were taught that the Black Panthers were wonderful and heroic, or Malcolm X is wonderful and heroic, when, you know, these were they may have been people who were facing injustices at the time, but they used violence, they used terrorism.
That's a sadness. What's your book on that topic called?
Well, the first book covers a lot of this stuff, and that's A Gift for Treason: The Cultural Marxist Assault on Western Civilization. And you know, I go through a lot of it there, and I'm sort of labeling it as cultural Marxism there, but you could label it as suicidal empathy, you could label it as progressivism, and you could label it as globalism. All of these groups, you know, the globalists at the moment are aligning themselves with communism and claiming that they're the defenders of the free world. You know, they're mainstream newspapers are on the side of people who are behaving like domestic terrorists in the US and saying that they're against fascism. Well, you know, the fascism is not in enforcing laws that already exist that are just. Fascism is in saying that you're going to stop a government enacting policies that won an election, right, because you don't agree with them. You know, and because nobody's ever allowed to follow that different path. Well, that's the fascism. So
I kind of want to circle back to quote Obama's press secretary, Jen Psaki, or maybe it was Biden's as well for a bit, to the Sunni Rishi Sunak, whatever you call him, election, and the splintering of the right. And what are the ways you, as a society, as a people, get out of the soup you're in? Or is it just kind of like frog is already in, he's just waiting to be boiled? I mean, first of all, do you have any regrets, you know, given the lesser of two evils? You know, I mean, things might have been bad under Rishi Sunak, but they weren't this bad. You weren't kind of circling the
Rishi Sunak isn't the regret. The regret is that I think Liz Truss was successfully removed by coup, because the things she said since she was removed have been eminently sensible, and you know, she was removed with a confected story, really, of economic collapse when the economic indicators weren't as bad as they are now. And none of the media is responding now the way they did to her. And we were told that it was her mini budget, which included tax cuts. That were that.
Oh my God, tax cuts! Oh no!
Yeah, I know, horrific. But we were told that caused a panic in the markets, and really it was actually a coordinated attack on her, with the Bank of England collaborating with financial speculators, and they effectively worked together with Tory MPs who wanted Rishi Sunak as leader instead of Liz Truss to remove her, and that was probably the last chance the mainstream Conservative Party had of doing things that are sensible and beneficial to the British people, and that would have, you know, if she had survived that coup and that you know, orchestrated attack on the pound, if she had survived that, then I think our government now would be a bit more sane and sensible than the current one. I mean, that said, you know, she was part of Conservative governments that did a lot of awful things, including their COVID policies. But we'd be in a lot better place now if Liz Truss hadn't been removed.
Yeah, but when the general election, or whatever you call it, where Starmer came into power, you know, he, as you mentioned before, had a, you know, 20-something% of the populace voted for him. But that's the way you have your elections. You have this, you know, checkerboard parliamentary system, and so all the districts, you know, they all pipe up, and you have to get over a certain barrier per district, whatever. That's the game such as it's played. And the Reform UK wasn't able to beat them, and there was a splintering on the right that allowed you know, a distinctly minority party to get in. And once they're in, you know, I mean, you know, I don't want to compare the two, but you know, that German or Austrian painter, whatever he was, he got in a very low amount of the vote, but once he's in, you couldn't get him out. And you know,
I think he got in on a higher percentage of the vote than the Labour Party did. Yeah,
but so what happens once? So you know, everyone who's pure, you know, didn't vote for the Conservatives in that, you know, election. But then you got something worse. Isn't frying pan to fire?
Yeah, but remember that this isn't. You know, really, the Conservatives had offered 30 years of betrayal, So their result was the punishment for that. Reform looked like the most likely to be able to do anything now, but the vote on the right is still split. There's still a
So is there
decent
hope
chunk of people
for
who
the
vote for
UK?
the
You got another
Conservative.
3.5 years of Keir Starmer, right?
Yeah, we've got to endure another 3.5 to 4 years of Keir Starmer still, but because that's how long they can extend it under our current
Does this
rules.
thing that the ship of, what is it, the ship of Theseus? You keep replacing things out. Is it still the same ship? Is the UK going to be something recognizable? If you replace all the parts therein and all the theories, whatever that got you where you were. I mean, or is it that just life and we should shut up and move
Well,
on? A lot of people.
I think the UK is in no worse a position than Canada, and which is not a good thing to say, than or many Western nations, or like Germany or France. We are in a roughly analogous situation to many other Western nations, and it's the whole of the Western world that is facing existential threats that our leaders are complicit with and on the side of, or they're
I
too
take
cowardly
exception
to
to that.
address.
I think, can we leave the US out of that for right now?
Yeah, but even in the US, what happened in Minnesota? You've got outright insurgency and domestic terrorism,
Yeah, well,
and
I think this is the dying.
is anyone going to be? Maybe Don Lemon will be punished, but is anyone else
No,
going to be
I think you're going to see it. I think there's been a lag. Everyone's impatient that we haven't had enough arrests and all that kind of stuff. But it takes a while. Hercules, what was it, the Augean stables? That when you get into Washington, if you look at the way DC votes historically in that whole Northern Virginia, Maryland belt, whatever, the DC megalopolis there, it's 95% Democrat. They know where their bread gets buttered. And when you become the head of the Justice Department, the which I put SIC, sick, the so-called Justice Department, when you become the head of that, you are the head of a bureaucracy that's filled entirely with Democrats. The secretaries, the attorneys, everybody. People there don't want your agenda to go. When you become the head of NIH, when you become the head of any of these agencies, they are all waiting for you to disappear, and they're going to put everything to bollocks you up. So I think it takes time to clear things out, and I think that if you show that you're going to hang around and the populace wants you and all that kind of stuff, things will work out. You notice that for all the stuff that's happening in Minnesota, that is one of 50, U.S. states. It's not happening to the same extent anywhere else. A little bit in Portland, whatever. But there are more deportations in Texas than in Minnesota. There's nothing going on in Texas. So these things are not abroad. It's where the forces get marshaled. I give always credit to the Marxists. They actually have the similar first letter to Marshall, MAR. They are able to marshal their forces for martial, warlike activities, and they are Marxist, and that by any means necessary. And they're able to do that. They're able to, put their signal groups, their doxing, all that kind of stuff. However, their financial engine is going to be compromised over time. I think, Elon Musk is brilliant, maintains brilliancy, whatever. But the biggest thrust that happened in the government was the uncovering of the USAID, the kind of kickback scheme. And once these loops get broken, they get cut, it's going to be harder. It actually segues very nicely into your thoughts about, all the moneyed classes that have been, dallying with leftists and whatnot. Tom Wolfe wrote about that, the Mao-Maoing of, I forget what it is, about all the Upper West Side, Upper East Side bunches who were, hanging out with the Black Panthers back in the 60s. I went to college in the 70s, and, in retrospect, a lot of the same stuff. And even now, when I go to my reunions and whatnot, they're all leftists, and it's like they're all wealthy, they're all leftists, and it's just kind of a funny thing, not just medically, but pretty much every group that I associate with at my kind of economic income tier, whether it's a tennis club, this and that, of other groups, whatever, they're all on the left. It's just kind of a ludicrous thing, and it's weird, so it's kind of I think when the meat of the hamburger kind of realizes you can have just as much nutrition without the buns, and a lot of the, I'm not sure I can belabor that analogy anymore, but hopefully the meat grows, and you have the better part of the hamburger, the part we all find delicious, and people realize that. The Reagan, I maintain my little, wishful, blissful, blithe hope of the Reagan phenomenon. I was not a Democrat before Reagan. I was kind of, maybe, excuse me, I was not a Republican or a conservative before Reagan. I grew up, like I said, New York City Democrat, and that was just like the water. I was surrounded like a fish. And it was kind of during the Reagan era that, all the things they said that was going to happen never happened. And all, surprising things like the Soviet Union fell, the economy got better. There was it was like a huge, I grew up in a horrible New York City, I got mugged, a couple times, and, got robbed. I was accosted in the subway, there was all the graffiti going on in the place. I mean, it repeats a little bit, but things got so much better when people just, used the statutes that were there. Giuliani was a carryover from Ronald Reagan. He made that city like shine. I just never thought New York City could shine. It was just, you go in there with a battle mentality. And that's where our cities are descending now, but they're doing it severally. Not all of them. Some of them are, some of them are not. And hopefully, people have enough smarts and wits about them to realize, you could do this, you could go with this, or you can go with that. There's a commercial with hamsters, or gerbils or whatever, for Kia that does that. It's a great song. And hopefully people realize it over time. And I think we see some, shifts. The question is whether you have fair and honest elections that people can kind of push that forth.
Yeah, I think the difference that was made in 24 from 20 is that there were people much better at watching and stopping the electoral fraud. And people much more invested in stopping it.
So we're going to end in a little bit, but just a quick question. Is that an issue in the UK? I mean, you have, kind of this, again, checkerboard election, so it's on a smaller basis.
Less so, I would say. That it's more like, the situation with London is similar to the situation with New York, where you've got very high immigrant population voting for people who will give them stuff. So, and you've got a Muslim bloc vote keeping Sadiq Khan as mayor. But in terms of like direct electoral fraud of the kind that occurred in 2020, we have very low levels of mail-in ballots, and then that helps a lot. And we have voter ID at the polling booth and the polling station. So you can be asked for your ID when you go and vote. So that makes a difference, I think, in the UK.
Does that help with the burqa or not?
Well, they've kind of worked on it in different ways. Like, for example, the UK government want to, and they're going ahead with giving the vote to 16 to 18-year-olds. So the vote had been 18 and up, and they're giving it to 16 and up, because really? because they think that
they're really going to be 16.
Yeah, it already is in some votes in Wales. They've already had 16-year-olds voting. That's one of the little schemes to try and kind of ensure a leftist win. But it's more through, the mainstream media brainwashing people over here at the moment than it is through direct electoral fraud. They don't really need direct electoral frauds because there's lots of people who are brainwashed. So,
all right. Well, I think you might have brainwashed me, so I gotta end this call pretty quickly. Where can people find you, and how can they support you, Daniel?
The easiest way to support me is to subscribe to my Substack, which is jupplandia.substack.com. So if you subscribe on there, I'm sort of pumping out articles every day virtually. So you get a lot of free stuff on there. And if you are kind enough to do a paid subscription, then that really helps me out. Otherwise, I'm on Facebook as well if anyone wants to befriend me on there. Enter the dark territory controlled by Zuckerberg.
Yeah. So I am one of your subscribers, and I'm just curious, who writes all your stuff?
I have a team. I have a team of like-minded fanatics who are all the same as me.
I have to say that you're one of my favorite writers. You write with wit and verve, and you're good at it, and you're prolific. And I don't think anybody could duplicate it. So that was a joke, everybody. But you should subscribe, such as I do, and learn from them. Learn at the feet of the master, the oracle of Basildon, and I appreciate you being on the show.
Cheers. I appreciate you having me on here, Randy.
All right. Thank you.